What if I told you that one of the most powerful nations on Earth, known for its global ambitions, trillion-dollar projects, and fierce diplomacy, chose silence when the world expected it to roar, while missiles were launched, alliances tested, and the world braced for a wider war? China, the dragon in the east, stepped back. But why? Was it fear? Was it weakness? Or was it something far more calculated? In this video, we're going to break down the hidden strategy behind China's decision to back off during the Iran-Israel conflict, just when everyone thought it would take a stand. You'll discover how silence can be louder than action, and how stepping back can be the most powerful move in a global chess game. This isn't just about war. It's about understanding how superpowers think, act, and win without ever pulling the trigger. So stay with me until the very end, because what you're about to hear will shift your view of global power, leadership, and what it truly means to play the long game. Let's begin. China's strategic silence in critical conflict zones like the Iran-Israel conflict is not accidental. It is a deeply rooted approach in its foreign policy doctrine and quest. Unlike Western powers that often rush to declare sides, deploy troops, or issue public condemnations, China tends to observe quietly from the sidelines. This silence is deliberate and calculated. China has learned through decades of economic rise that speaking less in volatile geopolitical affairs offers greater room for maneuvering. In the context of the Iran-Israel conflict, while the world watched for China's reaction, Beijing chose to stay diplomatically quiet, not because it lacked interest, but because it understood the high stakes involved. This pattern can be traced back to China's larger ambition of becoming a global superpower without getting entangled in wars it cannot control. Wars in the Middle East are messy, unpredictable, and far from China's borders. While China has strong economic ties with Iran, especially in oil and infrastructure, and growing business links with Israel in technology and agriculture, it refuses to put those relationships at risk by choosing sides in a military conflict. Instead of stepping into the battlefield or even issuing strong public statements, China leans into its long-standing policy of non-interference. This allows it to maintain access, trade, and influence with both sides simultaneously. Moreover, China has observed how American interventionism in the Middle East has backfired over the years. The US has spent trillions in wars that have only led to regional instability, damaged its global image, and drained its economy. China, on the other hand, believes in letting others bleed while it builds. When the Iran-Israel conflict intensified, stepping in could have triggered diplomatic backlash, threatened global oil routes, and possibly invited direct confrontation with Western powers. That's a price China is not willing to pay, especially when its economy is already under pressure from internal challenges and an intensifying rivalry with the United States. China's silence is not a sign of indecision or weakness. It is a strategic pause. A nation like China, obsessed with long-term outcomes, often finds more power in restraint than in reaction. Remaining quiet allows China to avoid commitments it may later regret and to enter conversations from a position of leverage once the dust settles. China's relationship with Iran is built on decades of economic and energy cooperation. But when the stakes rise into the realm of war, Beijing reverts to prioritizing economic stability over ideological loyalty. Supporting Iran militarily or even diplomatically in the heat of a direct conflict with Israel would endanger China's delicate position as a global economic powerhouse. At its core, China's foreign policy is driven by pragmatic national interest, not emotional or ideological alignment. Even though Iran is a key player in China's energy security and a participant in the Belt and Road Initiative, China will not jeopardize its trade ties with the West or risk global market instability by openly backing Tehran in wartime. Economic momentum is at the heart of China's modern identity. Its leadership understands that a war in the Middle East, particularly one involving Iran, could trigger a spike in oil prices, disrupt shipping lanes, and provoke Western sanctions. These outcomes would directly threaten China's economy, which is still recovering from the aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic and struggling with internal issues like youth unemployment, real estate debt, and a shifting demographic landscape. In such a fragile moment, economic turbulence caused by a geopolitical stance is a risk Beijing is unwilling to take. Additionally, China is not built to sustain ideological wars. Unlike the Cold War-era Soviet Union, China does not export its political system or ideology. It sells development, infrastructure, and trade, not revolution or resistance. Iran, with its theocratic regime and confrontational posture toward the West, often engages in ideological rhetoric and strategic defiance. Aligning too closely with Iran could pull China into a narrative of opposition against Israel and its Western allies, something that contradicts China's global business aspirations. By staying neutral or backing off, China shields itself from this ideological trap and preserves access to both Iranian energy and Israeli innovation. In Beijing's calculus, long-term economic resilience always trumps short-term gestures of solidarity. Even if Iran is facing overwhelming pressure or aggression, China is more likely to push for talks, de-escalation, or economic solutions rather than stand beside Tehran on the battlefield. When the war between Iran and Israel escalated, the true test wasn't about who had the bigger army. It was about who had the discipline to walk away from a tempting but costly alliance. China's decision to back off was not abandonment. It was preservation of its broader, richer, and more interconnected economic ambitions. China has spent decades crafting its image as a responsible, neutral global power, and this branding has become a cornerstone of its international strategy. Unlike the United States or Russia, which often take firm, visible positions in global conflicts, China seeks to operate behind the scenes, presenting itself as a mediator, a builder of peace, and a promoter of development. This image is critical to its success, especially in emerging markets where nations want infrastructure, investment, and trade, not war. In the case of the Iran-Israel conflict, any overt alignment with one side would risk unraveling that carefully maintained perception. For China, perception is power, and global trust is currency. By choosing not to involve itself directly or vocally in the Iran-Israel conflict, China reinforces its identity as a power that avoids unnecessary confrontation. The global community, especially in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, views China not just as an economic giant, but as a country that doesn't meddle in the internal affairs of others. That reputation is crucial for gaining long-term influence without triggering the fear or resistance that traditional imperial powers have historically generated. Were China to side explicitly with Iran, especially in a war that could escalate regionally, it would risk losing the trust of many nations that depend on its neutrality to maintain balance in their own foreign policy strategies. Moreover, China has worked tirelessly to distinguish its global rise from the West's approach, where Western nations often project military power to protect their interests. China leans into economic diplomacy, soft power, and large-scale trade projects. Its silence during high-tension conflicts like the Iran-Israel conflict is part of a broader effort to avoid looking like an aggressor or an opportunist. Beijing understands that joining any armed bloc could invite criticism, reduce foreign cooperation, and diminish its ability to strike trade deals across opposing camps. A neutral image allows China to talk to Israel about technology one day and negotiate oil imports with Iran the next. This strategic neutrality is also important for domestic consumption. The Chinese government needs to assure its population that it is maintaining stability, ensuring economic growth, and keeping the nation out of risky foreign entanglements. War is unpredictable, and public sentiment can turn quickly if the government appears to be gambling with the country's future. By backing off when tensions rose, China preserved its image as a calm, wise player on the world stage, one that is above chaos, not consumed by it. One of the primary reasons China backed off during the Iran-Israel conflict is the looming threat of economic retaliation, particularly from the United States. At this stage in global affairs, the battlefield is not just defined by missiles and tanks, but by sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial warfare. China is already locked in a tense economic rivalry with the US, marked by tariffs, technology bans, and growing mistrust. Adding fuel to the fire by taking Iran's side in a direct military conflict could provoke the kind of Western backlash that would further damage China's already vulnerable economic position. Beijing understands that economic warfare from the West can be more destructive than any traditional war in the region. Iran, being under heavy US sanctions, is already a high-risk partner. If China were to overtly support Iran during a conflict with Israel, it could become subject to secondary sanctions, measures that target countries and companies doing business with entities blacklisted by the US government. These sanctions can limit access to global banking systems, disrupt supply chains, and isolate Chinese firms from critical international markets. With China trying to stabilize its domestic economy, ensure foreign investment, and maintain smooth exports, this is a threat it cannot afford to ignore. Avoiding such consequences requires restraint, even when it has close energy and strategic interests with countries like Iran. Furthermore, the US plays a dominant role in international institutions and financial systems, such as the IMF, World Bank, and SWIFT. Any misstep that positions China as aiding or abetting a US-designated adversary like Iran could create obstacles in these areas. China's economy, though powerful, is still heavily integrated with global markets, and any friction with Western financial systems could lead to capital flight, investor uncertainty, and reduced foreign trade. As such, China opts for strategic ambiguity rather than open defiance. Beijing also knows that war alignment can cost it dearly in terms of access to technology, semiconductors, and innovation, areas where it still relies significantly on the West. The recent clampdowns on Chinese tech giants serve as a warning. If China had been seen as directly aiding Iran in the conflict, it could have faced harsher export bans, more aggressive tariffs, and a tightening of the global semiconductor chokehold. In today's world, economic survival and technological advancement are paramount, and China is playing a game of survival where backing off isn't retreat, it's risk management. China's approach to foreign policy and international conflict is defined by its deep-rooted philosophy of long-term strategy, rather than immediate gratification. In the case of the Iran-Israel conflict, Beijing's decision to back off wasn't a sign of fear or disinterest, but a reflection of its broader game plan. China doesn't aspire to be the loudest voice in global crises. It wants to be the most enduring power in global influence. This mindset separates it from many Western nations that often jump into conflicts to assert dominance or fulfill political agendas. Instead, China observes, calculates, and waits. It knows that true power doesn't come from headline victories, but from consistent, stable growth and expanding leverage over time. Walking away from the Iran-Israel conflict wasn't a passive act. It was a tactical move. China understands that wars are not just won on battlefields, but in boardrooms, supply chains, and long-term influence. Aligning with Iran at a time of direct conflict with Israel could have provided short-term geopolitical excitement, but it would have risked alienating many of China's partners and customers. Beijing sees more value in building ports, railways, and digital infrastructure than in engaging in symbolic standoffs. Every move it makes is aimed at reinforcing its long-term economic corridors, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and these require a calm, cooperative global environment, not one marred by deep military alliances and regional instability. China also knows that power lies in being the preferred partner when the smoke clears. By staying neutral, it leaves the door open to step in as a mediator, negotiator, or investor. Once both parties are exhausted from conflict, this positioning not only earns respect, but also creates opportunities. Nations that emerge from war need rebuilding, and China wants to be the one holding the blueprints and the budget. It doesn't need to prove its power by fighting. It proves it by being indispensable when others need help the most. The discipline to walk away from volatile conflict zones is not cowardice. It's a reflection of maturity. China's leadership is focused on creating leverage that lasts decades, not moments. In their worldview, taking a step back today often means taking 2 steps forward tomorrow. By backing off from the Iran-Israel conflict, China has protected its economic future, preserved its diplomatic flexibility, and positioned itself to gain more in the aftermath than it would have during the fray. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is China's signature global development strategy, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure network stretching across Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. This grand vision is designed not just to boost trade, but to establish China as the economic backbone of the modern world. Many of its most vital links run through or near the Middle East, making the region's stability crucial for the success of the entire project. If China were to involve itself directly in the Iran-Israel conflict, it would risk igniting tensions across the very corridors it has invested in so heavily. Pipelines, ports, highways, and rail networks built under the BRI could easily become collateral damage in a broader regional war. China has poured billions into projects in countries like Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and even Israel. These investments are not just financial. They are strategic assets aimed at long-term influence and access. If China was seen to be siding with Iran against Israel, it could alienate Gulf Arab nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of which have warming relations with Israel and remain critical BRI partners. The geopolitical balancing act China is trying to maintain in the Middle East would collapse under the weight of visible military alignment. Such a scenario would disrupt not only diplomatic relationships, but also physical infrastructure and future investment plans. Additionally, China's overseas assets, including ports, industrial zones, and energy terminals, are vulnerable to regional instability. Many of these are located in politically fragile countries or areas prone to sectarian conflict. A wider war, triggered by the Iran-Israel clash, could spill over into neighboring states, putting Chinese engineers, companies, and logistics routes at risk. Insurance costs would rise, foreign contractors could flee, and local resentment against foreign presence could be amplified. All of this would make the BRI far less viable and slow China's global momentum. Chinese economic ambitions require peace, far more than posturing. Its ability to deliver loans, manage projects, and control supply chains is only possible in a world where trade routes are safe and predictable. Any major conflict in the Middle East threatens to derail not just regional stability, but the very foundation of China's global growth strategy. Therefore, stepping back from the Iran-Israel conflict was not about fear. It was about protecting an investment plan that spans continents and decades, where patience, not provocation, is the true weapon of success in the chaos of global conflicts, especially one as sensitive and combustible as the Iran-Israel conflict. It's easy to judge silence as weakness and restraint as indifference, but real power doesn't always roar. It calculates, it waits, and it moves only when the return outweighs the risk. China's decision to back off when it mattered most wasn't a retreat. It was a masterclass in disciplined strategy. While others chase short-term victories, China builds long-term dominance. While others draw battle lines, China draws trade routes. And while the world watches missiles, China watches markets. This is not a story of cowardice. It is a story of choosing construction over destruction, patience over provocation, and foresight over fury. The true leaders of the future will not be the ones who shouted the loudest in times of crisis, but those who kept building when others were burning. And that's exactly what the world just witnessed. Good luck. And thank you for watching. Keep thinking, keep learning, and never stop asking why did they stay silent? Because sometimes the strongest move is no move at all.